everyone who's joined us in past sessions, and welcome to everyone joining us for the first time. We hope everyone is healthy and safe. My name is Helen Roldan, and I'm a researcher and outreach coordinator with the FIU Jorge M. Perez Metropolitan Center. Before we begin today, I will briefly introduce today's webinar, The Future of Affordable Housing Starts Now. Today's speakers will be discussing the impact of COVID-19 on South Florida's affordable housing issue. Today's session will be a mixture of panel style and presentation style. So our panelists will be answering questions from the audience throughout and towards the end of the session. Throughout the duration of the presentation today, you will be automatically muted. But if you wish to ask questions, please type them in on the chat feature on your Zoom window. You can also send them to me privately, and we'll try to get to as many as possible throughout today's conversation. Many of you also sending questions beforehand, so we'll be trying to get through some of those as well. We will be recording this session and we'll be posting the recording on our website. I will post a direct link on the chat, but our website is metropolitan.fiu.edu. We will also be emailing our participants a copy of today's presentation, and as well as a link to any upcoming webinars we have, so you can register in advance. I will now turn the mic over to our center's director, Dr. Howard Frank, who will be introducing the center and our expert researchers.
Thank you, Helen. Good morning. I'm Dr. Howard Frank, director of the Jorge M. Perez Metropolitan Center, a vital part of the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at FIU. Thanks for joining the sixth installment of our ongoing webinar series, Beyond the Headlines, the Current and Future Economic Impact of COVID-19. Today's webinar focuses on a critical economic issue for our region, affordable housing. Trying to make sense of critical issues is one of the reasons our center was founded in 1997 as an applied social research branch of FIU, dedicated to inform public policy in the region. Since then, we have grown to become South Florida's leading urban think tank. Our work has 4 pillars: economic development and housing policy, performance management, evaluation and survey research, training, and applied economic and demographic research. Decision makers in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors turn to us for thought leadership and policy guidance to improve their organizations and communities. We are evidence-driven and dedicated to enhancing the quality of life in our region. I hope you continue to follow our work on social media to see the depth and breadth of our community engagement. Now let me turn to brief biographies of our presenters, Dr. Ned Murray, Mr. Kevin Greiner, and Mr. Rene Rodriguez. Dr. Murray is Associate Director of Research at the Center. His expertise in economic development and housing is nationally recognized. Ned has authored numerous studies throughout the region and state with distinctive competence in affordable housing. Dr. Murray is a former practicing urban planner in Massachusetts, where he earned his PhD in urban and regional planning from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Kevin Greiner is a development planner, analyst, and policy researcher with over 25 years of experience, leading a wide variety of comprehensive redevelopment and planning projects as a consultant and principal in the public and private sectors. His research at the center focuses on regional economic competitiveness, community development, and best practices. Mr. Greiner received his Master of Urban Planning and Law degrees from the University of Buffalo State University of New York. Rene Rodriguez has worked at the Miami Herald in a variety of positions since 1989, including a reporter for the City Desk and general assignment writer for the Features Department. He was the Herald's movie critic from 1994 to 2017 and lived in New York City during that time. He has also written for the New York Times Sunday Magazine, Variety, Entertainment Weekly, and the New York Post. He studied film and journalism at the University of Miami and has won Green Eye Shade and Sunshine State awards for his work. He currently covers affordability and real estate for the Herald's business desk. Before I turn the virtual mic over to Mr. Rodriguez, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank my colleagues, Ms. Helen Roldan and Ms. Caroline Bernard-Stokes, for arranging the event. With no further ado, Mr. Rodriguez, you have the floor.
We'll be asking Renee a few questions this morning. Renee, you're on mute.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. So I'm going to go ahead and get this started. Renee, the Miami Herald ran an extensive series on Miami-Dade County's affordable housing crisis titled Priced Out of Paradise. What do you see as the major takeaways from your reporting?
Yeah, we spent about a year kind of taking a look at where we were as a city and how we got here. We kind of explored the affordability crisis from every perspective, not just the traditional affordable housing, but also the regular people who live here. And as FIU has stated often, more than 60% of Miami-Dade renters spend more than 30% of their income on housing, which means 60% more than half of the renters in Miami-Dade are cost burdened. And as you go down the income bracket, that burden becomes greater and greater. At the same time, our population exploded from 2010 by 500,000 people. So we have about 2.8 million people living in Miami-Dade County right now. And one easy way to think about the economic disparity in the city is if you think of the design district and you think of Midtown, you can go to Louis Vuitton in the design district and spend $10,000 on a purse. And then you can walk 2 blocks and go to Target and buy a shower curtain for $5. And I think that's a really simple way of thinking about the economic disparity in the city. It's not just the traditional low-paying jobs that are not keeping up with the economy, but it's also every bracket of employment, from like computer software to lawyers, are not making enough to pay their rent. And so what's happened is you're seeing traditionally historic neighborhoods. You're seeing neighborhoods like Little Haiti. You're seeing Overtown. You're seeing Liberty City, which have been traditionally cultural places, Little Havana. You're seeing people moving into those areas because that's the only place where they can afford to live. And you keep squeezing out that lower income population that has no place left to go. So part of our main takeaway of that series was that this population is in danger of just leaving the area completely and kind of robbing South Florida of the diversity that makes it so great.
Thanks, Renee. And I just want to remind the audience that you can ask Renee questions, and while we ask him some questions, we'll also incorporate some of the questions from the audience. Renee, so recent Miami Herald reporting has covered how the COVID-19 pandemic has further impacted Miami's affordable housing crisis. What has your reporting revealed?
Well, we started looking at, almost immediately when Mayor Carlos Jimenez imposed a moratorium on evictions, and the Federal CARES Act also imposed a moratorium on evictions for any government subsidized building. So it wasn't just Section 8 or housing or HUD or affordable. It was also any property that had federal subsidized money, Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae. And that really helped a lot in terms of stenching, the flow of evictions that we were expecting to see happen. We've actually only heard of 2 cases right now in the entire county of people who live in government subsidized buildings being served with a 3-day notice. And as soon as we reached out to them, the landlord rescinded those notices. So in March of this year, 93% of renters across the United States, were able to make either full rent payment or partial rent payment. In April, which was after the lockdown had gone into effect, that figure dipped to only 87%. We were expecting to see a bigger dip in that. We don't have the May figures yet. But what that tells us is that people who are unemployed, have lost their jobs, and were economically deprived to begin with, have been using the Federal CARES Act, the $600 in unemployment weekly, plus the state unemployment check, which is measly, but at least it's something. And they have been using that money primarily towards rent. And they've been relying on community assistance for food, for other kind of necessities. But people are not neglecting their rent. They're actually more mindful now than ever of the importance of having a roof over your head, because we don't know how long this is going to to go on. The question becomes, how long does this stretch out? Our state unemployment rate, they just announced on Friday, went from 4.4% in March to 12.9% in April. And it's supposed to rise a lot more in May. And our state revenue was off $878 million. A lot of that has to do with hospitality, hotel, restaurants. And again, these are all industries that employ a lot of low-income families. So the two things are kind of interlocked. As of right now, we seem to be weathering it okay, but the Federal CARES Act runs out at the end of July. And we don't know what's going to happen when that federal money stops coming in and people still have not found a job.
So I did receive a message, a private message, asking, you mentioned some of your reporting has had an effect, such as landlords rescinding evictions. Have you seen any other direct effects from your reporting?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
You mentioned some of your reporting has had effects, such as landlords rescinding evictions. Have you seen any other direct effects from your reporting?
In terms of affordable housing, no. I think the direct impact of COVID-19 on affordable housing, we're not going to really feel it until the fall. We have seen that pretty much everything that the county had in play, whether it was that we're getting ready to review the special area plans to make sure that developers couldn't come into a neighborhood that's economically deprived and just buy it all out. We had the FIU Affordable Housing Master Plan that was before the City Commission. All those things are frozen now because of the COVID virus. So in terms of, we finally had the top slot of importance, I think, within city government and county government, in terms of this is something that needs to be dealt with immediately because the center won't hold. But with the COVID-19 thing, I think it has dropped in terms of priority with government, and that's troublesome because things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. And if affordable housing is not part of that equation, it's going to exacerbate a problem that was already at a crisis mode to begin with.
Thanks, Renee. From a journalistic standpoint, what do you and the team of reporters at the Miami Herald see as the biggest challenges or stumbling blocks to addressing Miami-Dade's affordable housing issues?
Part of that is what I just said. Legislation, in other cities, if you look at the way other cities have handled their respective affordable housing crises, and every city has it, right? It's just different kind. I mean, you've seen things like Washington, D.C., they have equitable development, which is kind of similar to what we do here, but different. And the idea is, for example, if you want to build, they did it with this bridge that they built, and they built this bridge that's a pedestrian bridge. And one end of the bridge was in a very kind of upscale, nice neighborhood, and the other end of the bridge was in a very low income, economically deprived neighborhood. And so what they did in Washington, D.C. is they said, well, we'll let you build the bridge, but you got to spend as much money on this side, the side where people live, but no one necessarily wants to go visit, as you have to do on the other side. There's all kinds of ways that we can address this problem, but I think because our priorities right now are reopening, the hotels are going to reopen next week. The moratorium on evictions, on market rate evictions, is lifted on June 2nd, I believe. I think the biggest stumbling block I see is getting city governments and city officials to pay attention to this problem right now. I think it's understandable why they would put it on the back burner, but I think that's going to be the biggest stumbling block.
Thanks, Renee. Will this affect, in your opinion, do you think that this crisis is going to affect the cost of real estate? And do you foresee a decrease in the pricing of houses?
I think you're already starting to see a decrease in terms of real estate values, especially in the condo market. I think the number of condos that are for sale right now in Brickell. I don't have the exact number, but it's a staggering amount. Like nobody's buying. A lot of those people who buy in Brickell are from out of town, and because of the travel restrictions, nobody's buying. I think you will see a price correction, a much needed price correction in terms of real estate prices, right? Like the Miami-Dade market right now is overpriced and has been for a while because of demand. I think one thing the virus could do is it could be a big equalizer in terms of bringing some of those prices down. In terms of rents, though, that remains to be seen. If people can't buy a condo, they're going to rent. If they're unemployed, they're not necessarily going to be able to move or invest in a home. You know, they might put off that decision for a couple of years. And what that does is it keeps that apartment, which is market rate or below market rate apartment, it doesn't hit them. It's not available for anyone else to rent. Like everybody's staying put where they are now because of the fear of the economy. And so what happens is there's no way for someone who wants to, you know, move up to like a nicer apartment or a better apartment to, like, there aren't going to be any available at their price ranges. So it creates a backlog of demand, which will just exacerbate again the demand that there is for affordable housing.
Right, so we have time for a couple more questions, and we have received a bit. And I think Gustavo speaks for many of us when he says he loves your book collection in the back. So just wanted to give a shout out to that. To your knowledge, are the courts that handle evictions checking properties to see if each property has a federally backed mortgage?
So there have been about, I think the last number was about 640 evictions filed in the court system since Mayor Jimenez put a moratorium on them. Those evictions are in the system, but they're like, no one has acted on them. Like they're basically queued up. So we can't open them yet. They're on file, but we can't tell if it's commercial or residential real estate. And we can't tell what the reason for eviction is, whether it's non-payment or whether it's another matter. But the law very simply states that if it's government subsidized, they won't be able to carry out that eviction. And some landlords don't know that their properties have government subsidies. So we always tell people, if you're facing an eviction or if you're receiving a 3-day notice, ask your landlord if any part of his loan, and some banks sometimes sell those loans to Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae without telling the mortgage holder. So if it's any part of the property is government subsidized, the court will not proceed with the eviction right now. As starting at the end of July, they will be able to file those evictions as long as the federal government doesn't prepare another relief package.
Thanks so much, Renee. And final question, do you have an opinion on, and you mentioned DC earlier, but this is another question that came in. Do you have any opinion on what other major urban cities have done to move the needle on affordable housing objectives by creating a chief housing officer position, for instance? And do you think that this would be, what is your opinion on a position like this centered at the county mayor's office?
Well, like I said before, like every city has handled it differently. I think Denver has done something really interesting, which is similar to what you mentioned, which is they did create like a separate arm of, it's not separate because it works for the city government, but its primary focus is on housing. And they have resorted to inventive things that are particular to Denver, like a tax on marijuana, which I think the first year it was a 1% tax. And it brought in so much money that they raised it to, I think, 2% or 3%. And what that department does is it just focuses primarily on kind of processing applications and helping developers who want to build affordable or workforce housing not have to go through the whole spiel of the city. And that's something that FIU is proposing in its affordable housing master plan, which I think is a great idea. Just create an institution that works with and for local government, but is not tied to all the red tape and the permits, because it's a matter of urgency, and and it's something that has to be acted on now. And a lot of housing advocacy groups like Miami Homes for All have been affected by the virus as much as everyone else. And so their voices are not being heard right now either.
Thank you so much, Renee. And I know Renee will be leaving today's session a little bit early, but if you have any questions for him, Renee, if you're able to answer anything in the chat, you're more than welcome to. I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic over to Dr. Ned Murray, who's our next speaker. Thank you again.
Well, good morning, everybody. I hope all well. Thank you, Renee. That was a very interesting and informative interview. We want to thank you and your team of reporters at the Miami Herald who've been covering this issue for a long time and have done such a great job. Let me first start by saying once again the topic of affordable housing and the future of affordable housing now is really part of a larger research undertaking by the FIU Metropolitan Center. We began this research back in March, soon after the closure of our university and many other establishments. But we took on that challenge of providing what we thought would be a really important comprehensive analysis of the short and long-term economic and community impacts of COVID-19. And obviously in the first few weeks, we focused mostly on the business loss, employment loss, and then we get into the individual sectors in the subsequent weeks. So we've moved on to individual topics, starting with the most vulnerable industries, and a lot of those infographics are, in fact, all those infographics are on our website. Please visit them. A lot of useful information there relative to specific sectors. We then shifted more into the community and social environment, which is obviously an offshoot of what we're talking about today, one of the products of that research agenda. And then, of course, what are the actual strategies, the response strategies, both short and long term, that we need to be focused on? So we're going to be able to share with you today the housing piece. We have put together, and I believe they are available on our website, both a small business rapid response model and now an affordable housing framework with a rapid response element to it. But here's the challenge, and as Renee was speaking of earlier, this issue has been long-standing. Even though we're in a new world in many ways relative to COVID-19, a lot of the problems are older and pre-existing using medical terminology. And affordable housing is probably foremost. We had a crisis back pre-COVID, and guess what? That crisis has only become more magnified. So what we're arguing going forward, and our research will provide some of that thinking, is the need for short and long-term strategies by local governments, which also means adjusting and modifying our thinking, really rethinking. That's why we're calling it a new framework for ways in which we look at housing relative to the economy. And we're going to get into that quite a bit today, both in my presentation and in Kevin Griner's, which follows. So let's look at how we do that. How do we begin thinking about that in terms of economic distress and housing distress? They're one and the same. In all the affordable housing studies we've done over the years, we try to make that point that the demand side, or the affordable housing need side of the equation, is really about the economy. It's about our industries, it's about our occupations, it's about our wages, and ultimately our household income. So if you're going to have economic distress, which we already did because we had so much income inequality in Miami-Dade and South Florida to begin with, That created so much of the affordable housing issues that we had. Now we have this rapid job loss and near shutdowns of some industries that are causing even greater housing distress. But it all begins there. So that economic distress equals housing distress, that was in place pre-COVID. Now it's become magnified post-COVID. And the other thing we want to be able to, the point we want to get across, and Renee pointed to this, and we're going to speak to this throughout this morning, is that if we don't start connecting the two, economic distress and housing distress, and speak of them as one, there's the quality of life of our residents here just cannot be what it should be. If it's just barely paying the rent, or if you can't pay the rent or the mortgage, you really don't have much of a quality of life. So that's what we need to be focused on, is quality of life, and then where does the economy and where does housing fit into that? So that's what we ought to be talking about and focus going forward. And we're going to need to integrate these policy approaches, because our concern is, as I state there, that we're right now very focused on business assistance and jobs. Of course, those are the numbers that we're all focused on, as well as the actual health impacts from the virus. But we have to be thinking about our communities in a much more holistic and integrated way, because on the final point, we really expect to see affordable housing funding becoming more scarce as governments, particularly at the federal and state level, focus more on business assistance and job creation or job reentry, which they should. But on the other hand, you cannot separate out the housing piece, because this is where people live, and more people are working from their homes and will have to work from their homes going forward. So the programs that we're used to, the Sadowski money that we finally got in full this past year, are certainly in jeopardy. So with that, we move on to discussion in terms of how we go about that. And the next slide gets into our framework, and the beginnings of our thinking, our methodology, by looking at the numbers once again. The numbers, looking at April's numbers that came out of the Department of Economic Opportunity. These are the first, as many of you know, the first full numbers. So we had April, we had part of March, but these are the numbers for the full month of April for the three counties in South Florida. And they really show you what 1 month can look like. It was really a tsunami. We as I mentioned in previous webinars, we lost more jobs in the first 2 weeks than we lost in the 2 years, versus 2 years of the 2008 recession. Now, the numbers you see here aren't the full numbers. These are the ones that we're focused on. These are the sectors that we know comprise most of our employment in South Florida, but they're also the ones where most of our low and moderate income renters and population also work. So that's why we're seeing these numbers. These numbers are actually much higher than what you're seeing here. You can see Miami-Dade at 103. Miami-Dade, just in the month of April in total, lost about 160,000 jobs, which is kind of hard to fathom that you could lose 160,000 jobs in a period of years, let alone a period of just 2 months or 9 weeks in this case. And you can see those other numbers for Broward and Palm Beach. But the ones that really jump out is your, of course, accommodation, food services. That's the big one. But we're also seeing it across sectors. And that's another concern that we have right now, is we're focusing on, at least in the first few weeks, where we knew we were going to take the hit, which was accommodation, food services, and retail. But we're now seeing job loss in every sector, even sectors that are on this list. Every major sector, including professional positions, jobs in that sector, are also being hit hard. So we'll wait to see what the May numbers look like, which will come out in the second week of June. But we expect, obviously, this to continue. And the question now is, where do we bottom out? So with these numbers, the next thing we want to look at is the housing market, of course, and particularly the renter housing distress that we know, as Renee had mentioned at the outset, what was already a major issue in terms of cost burden. But we're using this term distress more and more now in our studies and analysis, because we have to look beyond just the cost burden relative to the housing cost, but the overall distress levels relative to once you make that rent payment, if you can make that rent payment, what do you have left to pay for medical costs and food and other things that's so essential. So we need to begin thinking like that in that manner, because that gets back to the whole issue of quality of life. So here are the numbers, the calculations we made, taking that 60% and 55% and whatever it is for each county in terms of cost burden renters, but really kind of focusing on the severely cost burden renter households, which we know are being the most impacted. So at 50%, of course, I think you all know that that's you're paying 50% or more of the income on housing costs, which leaves you very little. So what we think is happening relative to these numbers is that people were probably already cost burdened, these being renters, in the 30 to 50% category of cost burden, and with the loss of jobs, post this would be post CARES Act. If this money is gone, you would then see these kinds of changes in the severely cost burden numbers, where people who were cost burden under 50 would jump into that severely cost burden category very, very quickly. And you can see to the next column to the end, the estimated new total severely distressed renter households, a big jump there, with 34,000 in Broward, 46,000 in Miami-Dade, and 27,000 in Palm Beach, for a total of 108,000. Those are huge increases, as you can see by those percentages. Now, the other piece that's missing here, of course, is if you're already severely cost burdened. Now, we're just looking at those who cost burdened but not severely cost burdened. If you were already cost burdened and you've lost that job, and we get into a situation post-July where those checks aren't there, we are then looking at folks that will not be able to afford the rent under any circumstances, and we could actually see a big spike in homelessness. So that's a major concern of ours going forward. So going forward with the analysis, we take these numbers and begin to think of what type of a needs assessment needs to be done right away, and that's the whole point of the webinar. Once again, is how do we do this now? How do we begin this now? So what we're talking about here is an enhanced needs assessment that first looks at the analysis of the populations in the neighborhoods that have been disproportionately impacted first by the virus and continues to do so, including Blacks, Latinx populations, female-headed households, and households of low socioeconomic status. We need to target these locations within our cities, respective cities and counties, because we know, based upon both the virus and the job loss, these are the most impacted households. So we then look at we need to look at the worker wages and the lost income in these locations, and this is all information that can be attained, and so we can begin to think of what would be the mitigation to that. What could be types of programs that could be put in place, including ongoing rental assistance and other types of programs that could be put in place to obviously help adjust adjust for lost income in these locations. And then we'll need to look at median family and household income adjustments overall, because obviously a lot of our programs, whether they be HUD or state or even local, based upon median family and household incomes, we need to be able to adjust them based upon the new unemployment numbers. The next aspect of the assessment is to actually do a calculation of what this means in terms of residual income and overall distress. So it's not just a question of are you paying 40% of your rent or 50 or 60. The question is, what is your overall distress, and what is that distress index that we need to be able to show? That's going to be really important as part of this needs assessment. We're going to have to start looking at updated worker inflow outflow patterns. How's that impacting our local economy? How's that impacting our workers? We know now there's a real disconnect between worker inflow and outflow, but we're going to have to really keep an eye on that in terms of how that's going to play out over the next year. And then we need to do those projections, the long-term employment loss gained by occupation, and make those adjustments by industry sectors. What's realistic in terms of recovery? Where do we expect some job growth in specific industries, in specific occupations, and how that will look over time? So those are the key elements of the needs assessment. Then we get into, well, what does this all mean from a policy standpoint? So in terms of policy direction, the new model looks at distressed housing once again, and this understanding going forward in this COVID and post-COVID world that we're entering. We still have to get back to the rapid response, so that quick and insightful analysis is what's really going to be important, that we do that right now, because we know people are already hurting, particularly from a health standpoint, but also in terms of job loss and stress on income. But we know that it's only going to get worse if the jobs don't come back, and we do not have a continuation of the CARE Act post-July. So we need to be doing this type of analysis right now in terms of what's happening in these communities and how they will be further impacted. So then we do a snapshot of where the most vulnerable are, where they live, their income, and the forecast once again by industry and occupation, where we may see some type of reentry into the workforce here in South Florida. And those forecasts that we'll be doing, we need to look at them in both short and longer terms. So we're looking at 6, 12, and 18 months for those occupations most at risk. And Kevin's going to get into a little bit more of that, the at-risk employment, because that's a really important thing that we need to consider in all our calculations. And then what's the prognosis for local economic and household family income recovery? What that may look like based upon employment down the road, hopefully, and then some level of industrial expansion, which we're going to get into at a later date. The other, or should I say, the final 3 policy directions that local governments need to consider right now, and local organizations as well, and everyone else is on the call today, because it impacts all of us, whether it be in the public, nonprofit, private sector. But we need to then do a housing market assessment that does factor into what the shifting demand and supply will be as a result of COVID-19. Renee mentioned that the real estate was down, and it is. People, as he said, are not buying and moving, and so there's lack of mobility right now, and that could actually happen for quite a while. But then once they do, where will those adjustments occur? What type of housing is going to be, and what locations are going to be more impacted in, but also where might some of the opportunities be relative to the shifting demand and supply thinking. And then we need to look at the adequacy of our local public finance and resources, and our implementation capacity to deliver these needed policies and programs. We may be short-ended right now in this regard. We know the public finance resources aren't there. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about how we can do that. We can, as I said earlier, we can expect reductions in a lot of these housing programs as far as funding, given the fact that the economy is going to be the focus, and housing somehow gets left out of that quite often. But we also have to be thinking in terms of, like everything else, what is our organizational response to that? What is this what is this community development delivery system going to look like to make sure that we have the capacity not only to use the resources we have most effectively, but how do we leverage those and bring in other opportunities along the way. And then we need strategies that to address what we know will be anticipated choke points in the housing market, in the economy going forward, and then develop targeted strategies to best meet the local needs. And this will involve all the sectors: the financial, the institutional, nonprofit, philanthropic, and of course government. So we need to be thinking once again in a very public-private way to think about how all our sectors work together to address these anticipated choke points and to begin to develop strategies that are very specific to those who are most in need, and particularly those who are going to be most in need in certain neighborhoods and communities throughout South Florida, but also to come up with strategies that really make sense and can be effective both on the short term and obviously, as Renee was saying earlier, on the longer term, as recovery happens at some point, but may not be adequate enough to assist the renters who will be extremely in need for the next year or two. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kevin. Kevin's going to get into some of the more specifics of these numbers and what some of the solutions are as well.
Thanks, Ned. We're going to go ahead and start it up. Okay, we're just waiting for the PowerPoint. Morning, everyone, and thank you, Ned. I'm going to echo a number of the sentiments, but we're really busy working on not just analytics, but now really making the leap from analytics of what's going on, trying to understand what's going on, and really moving into policy. Next. Housing, affordable housing, and it's like Renee said, now is not the time to step off the gas on affordable housing. Affordable housing is a key foundation of the local economy. It's a key part of how families build wealth and move upward economically. Families that can afford their housing spend more on healthcare. They're healthier because they have more money. Families that have more money because their housing is affordable spend more money in the local economy, and that's good for everybody. Affordable housing helps you retain your young talent in particular. And as we've talked about, housing is actually an engine of economic development. It's an engine of job creation. And in Miami-Dade in particular, it's a real engine of small business creation. 60% of all new businesses start out of a home. In Miami-Dade, it's 55% of all employment is with single employers, most of them working out of homes. And in the new post-COVID world, more people will continue to work from home. The number was 25% of the total workforce. That's going to go way up. And importantly, it's also housing is a crucial component of municipal tax revenue. We don't want to see that take a major hit. Next. What we've learned, and this is from our current research and from the experience of the last recession, is that without aggressive public response, the housing market will collapse. And as we're saying, housing policy is now. Job recovery is going to take time, and it's really important. The money that's going into small business support is real important, but recovering those jobs, as I'm going to show, is going to take some time. The housing impacts are going to be right now. We're going to start seeing impacts from the housing market at an accelerated rate. And the solutions, depending on how you look at it, fortunately, unfortunately, are going to be local. There isn't going to be a cavalry coming to the rescue on this in terms of funding from larger governments. Next. We need to make the case of really how bad it's going to be. I mean, if you look at the jobs that are being lost, jobs with the lowest educational requirements and lowest pay are the most vulnerable to loss. Next. As you can see, the sectors that are taking the biggest hit, and those that are most vulnerable, it's accommodation, food services, retail trade, administration and waste, Healthcare, the lower paying jobs in healthcare are being shed off. Unfortunately, in Miami-Dade, these are the sectors that we are most concentrated in, so that we're especially vulnerable. Next. As we've seen, 86% of the jobs that are being shedded, and those are most vulnerable, are those paying $40,000 a year or less. So the most vulnerable among us are taking the worst hit. Next. Already, 59% of hourly wage workers have stopped working, and that number is expected to stay relatively constant as more people are laid off, even as some people go back to work. Next. And the worst may not be over. Dr. Murray ran through the numbers, the unemployment numbers so far. The best estimates right now is anywhere from 30 to 40% of the total jobs in the Miami metro may be at risk of loss. That's a giant, giant weakness. We're about fifth or sixth kind of weakest economy in the nation on that basis. Next. The forecast also, unfortunately, is that recovery is not going to be quick. It's not going to be short, and it's not going to be easy. And especially in sectors that are reliant on close contact, will take anywhere from a year, and in some cases up to 2 years, to begin real recovery. Air travel among them, hospitality, entertainment, major sectors of the Miami-Dade economy. It may take to the end of 2021 before they start showing any real recovery. And along the way, we may lose as many as 25% of our small businesses, another major hit in the Miami-Dade economy. Next. This is what I mean about no cavalry. And as Renee mentioned, I mean, there has been literally trillions spent on support for renters, for individuals, for families, for businesses. But those benefits, it was tough stretching those. They're all running out. The window's closing quickly. You look at all of the federal programs, the longest programs are reaching out until the end of the year. Most have either ended or ending within 6 months. On the statewide level, the moratorium on residential evictions ends June 2nd. The Florida reemployment program ends at the end of the year, which added extended unemployment benefits. And at the local level, the counties come in with $5 million of business relief. And at the moment, they're not acting on evictions, but that policy is scheduled to come up June 1st. It's unknown whether that's going to be extended. Also, the CARES Act covered a small slice of housing. Most of our housing market, private ownership in particular, is fully exposed to these kinds of dangers. Next. In terms of numbers, now these aren't additive, but this is the scale we're talking about. If 35% of the workers in just Miami-Dade County are vulnerable to loss, that's 400,000 workers. Not all of them may lose their jobs, but that's the potential. Cost burden renters, as Dr. Murray discussed, but just the ones below median income, over 200,000. The same with homeowners, over 100,000. And what's left out of the discussion is that as renters are unable to make payments, landlords in small buildings, the so-called mom and pop landlords, are at severe risk. They're small businesses like everybody else, but if they get into a foreclosure situation, that's as bad. That takes affordable units off the market, that takes housing units off the market. So considering multifamily units, especially in small buildings, another major consideration. That's a big chunk of Miami's real estate market. Next. The dangers ahead, we've already seen sales drop 40% from last April of last year. Are we looking at another single family foreclosure wave? More renter evictions? Even if owners decide not to keep or not to evict tenants, there's still a rent clock that's ticking, and they have to make payments on their debt and their bills as well. And the impact, as I said, on mom and pop landlords. We're looking at a foreclosure wave on small rental properties. Those are the ones, 20 units and less. Next. When properties go into foreclosure, there's a huge spillover, and this is the real danger. The economic damage from foreclosures isn't just that single home at a time, but national research and research that we followed up on locally, property values can drop into as much as a half-mile radius, up to 5% for properties surrounding foreclosed properties. It sets off a shockwave. Next. The other issue is that when an owner gets into foreclosure the first time, this is a shocking number. 32%, a full third of county homeowners filing for some form of foreclosure recently filed once before in the previous 10 years. So it's like a wheel you get onto that's very difficult to get off of, and it creates that cycle. And lastly is lost property tax revenue. A hidden number that nobody really talks about is that the county took a permanent hit in terms of its property tax revenue. Now, the total value of properties grew because population grew by about 50,000 people since the last recession. But on a per capita basis, adjusted for inflation, per person, the county's collecting about 12% less in property taxes than it did at its peak in 2007. It's a permanent loss to property tax revenue. Next. So what do we do in looking at this new next wave of affordable housing? As Ned said, traditional public sources are going to be really scarce. The real keys that we're stressing in terms of strategy is that cities are going to have to invest their way out of the recession. Like I said, this is not the time to lay off the gas, not the time to tap the brakes, but this is time to get aggressive about housing investment as well as economic development because the potential damage is so great. Affordable housing solutions, especially in Miami-Dade County, aren't going to rely on mega projects. They're going to rely on smaller projects, 50 units and less, and a lot of individual homeowners, builders, and renters. We need to create aggressive and really creative market support programs right now. Can't wait, can't let the market play out on this because that will be disastrous. That's the mistake that was made in the last recession. Aggressive support wasn't initiated fast enough or early enough. And avoiding long-term structural damage is going to be a local issue. Federal and state money, the feds, it's difficult to see that they can keep spending a lot of money, and it's hard for a lot of that money to reach a lot of people. So it's going to be a local solution. Next. In terms of really what's available and quickest things to do up front. In terms of strategy, prepare to focus on stabilization. It's keeping people in homes, keeping renters in apartments, most important issues. And analytically, the smartest thing to do is to really develop good numbers to target your most needed households and properties. In terms of financing, although public funding may be shrinking in terms of affordable housing, the expectation in investment circles is there's going to be a boom, a huge boom in private money moving into affordable housing programs. Top of the list is shared equity mortgage loans. This is where an investor actually buys with a homeowner or with a prospective homeowner a portion of their ownership in their home. What it does is reduce the mortgage payment, gives them flexibility on repayment, gives them flexibility on making repayments if they run into financial trouble, and the investor shares in the value of the home. The homeowner gets to build their equity as well. It's a program that was beginning to start prior to the pandemic. It's now expected this may become one of the major private investment vehicles. So we're suggesting to municipalities, get out in front of this. Make the private money that's moving into the market on this work for you. Partner with investors that you're confident in, that share your goals in terms of supporting owners and renters. The same with shared equity investment exchanges. 22% of mortgages now are made with non-related people sharing ownership in a property. Creating exchanges to connect those people together. It's a great way for young new buyers to get into a property. It's a great way to support somebody who's already in a property who may be in trouble. Creating an exchange, getting those people together quickly. Great idea. Non-cash, using other people's money. Partner with REITs. The REITs are now going to be moving back into the market as well in the same way. They're going to be financing equity programs, purchases. Partner with REITs that share your values. and really aggressively start using loan guarantees. They're not used enough in the public sector. Loan guarantees don't need to cost anything. Next. Other ways of, since housing money may be shrinking, there is going to be economic development funding still out there. Sources of economic development funding that can be used for housing and have been in the past, but are relatively untapped in Miami in terms of developing and supporting new housing, new markets tax credits, partner with somebody who has a source and wants to invest in good projects. It's for mixed use, multifamily projects. All of the state of Florida economic development programs focusing especially on infrastructure. That money will be good money for a time. Make use of that for housing. And supporting affordable housing land purchase, which is not often done. We've discussed it before, but supporting everything from a small developer, small builder to individual homeowners to buying land and giving them generous terms, even 0% interest and extended non-payment, to put together a new housing project will help increase your stock. Next, that's all with other people's money. This is also key, and this is what I mean about not taking your foot off the gas. It's really key. One of the reasons that Miami-Dade is so susceptible to recessions and events like this is that our economy is structured in a way such that we have huge chunks of vulnerable sectors. We really need to rethink and use the pandemic, use our post-pandemic responses to rethink entire economic development structure, industry structure, and start building new businesses and focusing on new skilled employment, higher wage, higher skilled, higher tech jobs. Now is the time to do that, not pull away from it. We should also be thinking about driving new construction technology. Right now, the construction industry is not capable of meeting demand. It's not capable of servicing the needs of the country in a post-COVID environment. It's looking at a 1 million worker shortage over the next 10 years. And the demand right now is outstripping the industry's ability to deliver. Let's think about modular prefab supporting new technology, new materials, new processes as a way to expedite productivity, bring new units, and also repair to the market faster, and also, by the way, create new skilled employment and new businesses. It's also the time to focus on job training. As I mentioned, construction alone is looking at a 1 million person, and this was prior to the pandemic, a 1 million worker shortage over the next 10 years. Young workers are not going into construction. We need to rethink our training, rethink how we finance and how we move construction. Now's the time to focus on job retraining because a lot of jobs may not be coming back and people are going to need to make that shift. Next. There are other non-cash, non-money things that municipalities can do. If you're thinking about streamlining or have been thinking of attempting to streamline your zoning permit review, go full stop, full ahead on streamlining your zoning and permitting. This is money. This is money to small, especially money that costs a lot to small homeowners, small developers. If you're also thinking about upzoning density and relaxing parking requirements, this is cash in the pocket of property owners, a way to help finance new construction, repairs, and maintain and expand your stock of affordable housing, because the more units you allow on per acre is actually putting a higher profitability and greater incentive into the hands of that property owner or developer. Simplify and centralize your access to affordable housing development and finance programs. It's traditionally been a game for very large developers. It needs to be opened up to everyone, as I'm saying at the end. Small, large, even individual homeowners, because that's who's going to be driving, and renters, who's going to be driving the recovery. Next. The last thing, and this may not seem to be a housing strategic policy, but it really is. You're going to see a lot of governments go through kind of a knee-jerk cost-cutting exercise. Well, we've got to start slashing costs. We've got to start laying off employees. Be really cautious. You look at total employment of the local, and this is just local government, not federal and state, just local government in Miami-Dade County. It's 96,000 people. It's 8% of total employment, 10% of total wages, And government jobs generally pay better than the private sector, especially in management positions. Cutting and slashing local government employees will have a disastrous cyclical effect on your housing market. If you start laying people off, a lot of government employees are homeowners. They may be looking then at defaults. They may be looking at foreclosures. You're now just shooting yourself in the foot in terms of accelerating your own potential foreclosure waves and distressed homeowner and renter waves. So be very cautious. Do whatever you can before cutting somebody's job completely. Is think about, job sharing, 4-day work weeks, across the board salary cuts, whatever it takes to keep people working so that they can continue to afford, like the rest of the economy, continue to afford to pay that mortgage and rent payment is crucial. And that needs to be thought at the municipal level here in Miami-Dade. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin and Ned. You've given us a lot of great insight, a lot of quality information and data to consider. So we're going to go into the Q&A portion. We've received a lot of great questions from the audience. I'm going to start it off with, what action can an ordinary citizen do to advocate affordable housing solutions? Ned or Kevin?
I'll jump on it. Contact your county legislator to begin with, state representatives, even Senator Rubio has indicated some real interest in some creative new tax programs to help support affordable housing. Prior to the pandemic, he was talking about actually a luxury tax, which is very interesting for a Republican to be talking about. But at the local level as well, urge your county legislature to keep moving on this and not sit on the sideline and find ways for the county to take leadership. It is hard. The smaller governments in Miami-Dade, it's very difficult. Their finances are going to be very stretched. The county really is the big player. I see the county as really being able to turn the tide if it wants to in Miami-Dade County.
Thanks. What are your thoughts on Section 8 home buyers program? This is from David. And what is being done to shift from a rental housing market to affordable home ownership?
Ned?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yep.
Oh, good. My speaker wasn't working there. Sorry about that. Well, going forward, we're going to have to look at programs in Section 8 like we once did. The Section 8 rental assistance program and vouchers that we have now obviously just aren't enough around to make the difference. Obviously, those who have them, it's great, but there was a day when Section 8 was also used for new construction. It was used for mod rehab. It was used for sub rehab. We have to be thinking Section 8 or some program like that at the federal level. So here's where Washington comes in, but because there will have to be at some point a massive response, even prior to COVID, to the nation's affordable housing crisis, not just here in South Florida. We have to look at some form of deeper subsidy in terms of Section 8 as it relates to other types of development activity, not just strictly rental assistance. But for now, it's very, very difficult because there's just so little around. And obviously, we haven't built any public housing as well over the last 20, 30 years, I believe now. So we have a shortage there. But also, obviously, Section 8 is not the program it used to be. So we have to figure out ways to better leverage what we have. But in the future, we're going to have to look at some major changes to the Section 8 program, or come up with new programs altogether to address development and rehabilitation at the national level.
Thank you. Adrian asked, last year, FIU stated that we need over 120,000 units of housing to meet current demand. Has FIU factored in the additional demand for affordable housing that has been created by the COVID-19 epidemic?
Not yet. The numbers prior to the pandemic were worrisome enough, and we haven't factored in the new demand yet. But that's just going to take those numbers, stratospherically higher.
Yeah, and we already looked at one of the earliest slides, Adrian, what we see as the transition from cost burden to severely cost burden if these numbers continue to play out in terms of job loss and the loss of the CARES Act. So we do expect a lot more cost burden, particularly on a severe level, but also greater distress and potentially homelessness.
We got another question. This one is anonymous. So urban density and infill development has been pointed out by the FIU Metropolitan Center and other sources as key factors towards housing affordability. Is COVID-19 a strong factor to shift public perception away from high rises, high density areas towards suburbs in fear of contagion of the virus?
That's a really good question. You have to anticipate, there's no getting around the fact that space acreage is shrinking and limited in Miami-Dade County. Even more limited in the city of Miami, which has the highest demand per person. So the higher density is eventually your solution to more affordable, and it's any way you look at it, it's the way that the housing stock is going to have to grow. We don't have the space, we don't have the room. We've got a hard boundary in terms of the Everglades, in terms of spreading suburban style development. So there's no two ways around it. I don't think you can make an either or. Obviously, a vaccine, other solutions are going to be necessary, but high density is a solution here that we can't run away from.
Yeah, and we should also remember that, and we're seeing it already, that people staying close to home right now, they're going to want to stay close to home for quite some time. So keeping people in their homes and rehabilitating those homes and providing maybe more space through ADUs, accessory dwelling units, may be something that we want to accelerate, because that provides more opportunities for existing homeowners to rent, but also be able to pay their mortgages, and at the same time create a little more space, because there's going to be a much greater demand for remote working at all levels. So that's where we need to focus on that end. And as I said earlier, part of the analysis that has to be done on an ongoing basis is to really monitor these changes in demand and supply, and what are people thinking from a consumer standpoint. But some things we already know, and that's one of them, that people don't want to stay home, they don't want to stay closer to their home, and we already know that ADUs work, and we know housing rehab is a need that needs to be addressed in the first place.
Thanks. One participant asked if Kevin can go a little bit more in depth on how affordable housing being available to everyone can help, and how would that work?
Well, and Renee said it up front, affordability isn't just a low income issue. In Miami-Dade, it goes across the income spectrum. And it's really important at a lot of levels. Most fundamental is making sure that somebody with low income and now no income can afford to stay in a home, can afford in a decent home, and isn't forced out and isn't forced to make a real choice on housing quality, but can afford to stay in a home. It's really important for the broader economy. The more money that we keep in the pockets of families that isn't having to be spent on housing is really good for the entire economy. It ends up creating thousands of jobs, new public revenue, and it actually supports entire industries like construction and retail. It's also really important future looking in terms of supporting our workforce. We're now, and we said it in other presentations, we've been noting this trend for 5 years. Young graduates, young workers are forced to make a real difficult choice between earning more and paying less for housing in another area, even hot places like Austin, Texas. You're going to earn more money for the same job and pay less for housing versus staying in Miami, earning less and paying more for housing. It's a difficult choice to make, but they're being forced to leave the region for economic reasons. So we're losing a lot of young talent that should otherwise be staying in the region. That's your next generation of entrepreneurs, business owners, and talent that supports the growth of other businesses that they work for. So, I mean, I could go into more, but those are just, I mean, three of the top points. Affordable housing, and that's why it's one of our mantras. It's not kind of either or. It's not economic development versus housing. It's not economic development instead of housing. They're one and the same. Housing is economic development. You can't separate the two.
One person asked, when will we start building affordable housing in South Florida?
Well, I can answer that. I was here. Affordable housing was not a big issue in South Florida right up until about 2004 and 5. There was an old saying that the thing about Miami and South Florida is the dirt is cheap, and it was for the most part. Our biggest concerns 20 years ago had to do with housing conditions, as obviously a lot of the housing was in need of repair, and it's only getting worse now since then because the housing is getting older. But it really became the big issue in 2005 and 6 during the so-called bubble, and obviously it hasn't let up since that time. So it's been a major policy issue. We've been obviously dealing with it. Every community I know pretty much and county that we've worked with doing affordable housing studies since 2005 and 6, and we'll continue to do so. But as Kevin just mentioned, we need to get policymakers in particular to understand that affordable housing cannot be looked at in this silo type of way. That affordable housing is part of the local economy and regional economy. They're one and the same. We can't continue to separate them out. That housing is an industry in and of itself. Very, very important sector. So it really needs to be linked to our economic development to make sure that everyone, and we know who everyone is, for the most part, we have, as the numbers show, most of our people who live and work here of low and moderate income. So that's the big chunk, but we also need to make sure that we don't continue to do what we've done in areas like West Kendall and down in Homestead and all the way north up into St. Lucie is build housing so that because that becomes somewhat affordable for those who do want to purchase, and then we create this really difficult situation in terms of our overall economic geography, where people are moving further and further away from their work. So it all has to be taken into consideration, and as I said earlier, it has to be looked at in a unified way and in a very integrated way.
Well, and the other reality, and this is what we mean about housing and economy being joined at the hip. The flip side of affordable housing development is we can't build our way out of our affordable housing problem. We can add units. We can add lots of units. Supply alone isn't the answer. It's part of the solution. The other side of the solution is that we need to build an economy with a much higher proportion of higher wage jobs, higher skilled jobs. That really is one of your ultimate solutions to housing affordability is raising incomes. The reason we're more unaffordable than San Francisco is not because housing is more expensive here. It's hugely more expensive in San Francisco, but people earn a lot more there. We were looking at higher prices and lower wages. It's a rather simple math, but that's really part of the policy equation as well is, and also let's not take our foot off the gas, as I've been saying, on rethinking our economy for a higher wage, higher income, higher tech.
So Allison from the Center for Independent Living of South Florida asks, what solutions are being explored to ensure that current and future housing is accessible for those with disabilities? I know our center did a few studies on this. The most recent one was for the town of Miami Lakes in the special needs community, but Dr. Frank and Dr. Chava worked on a report a couple of years ago. But Kevin and Ned, any comments on that?
Well, I'll just say this, a comprehensive affordable housing strategy needs to address housing for everybody. And obviously there's gaps often in housing policies and strategies relative to certain populations, and we need to be able to address that. Special needs housing, the homeless, others need to be part of that larger thinking. And our saying has always been that you need to provide a spectrum of housing choice and opportunity for everyone. And so we do need to have very specific policies and strategies to address the full spectrum of housing needs that's out there. And it needs to be very explicit. It's not just something that you put in the last chapter of a study. Each of these areas of need to be addressed in a very thoughtful way.
Next question, and we have time for just a few more questions before we wrap up. Gabriella asks, what role does Airbnb play when it comes to affordable housing in a post-COVID-19 era?
I don't have a lot of good things to say about Airbnb, especially the state's policy passed in 2010, the Homeowners Bill of Rights. Basically, if municipalities who hadn't prior to 2010 had a standing zoning legislation regarding what are called short-term rentals, anything less than a year, the homeowner's free to do what they want. We're seeing some good, but a lot of bad. Yeah, it's an opportunity for a homeowner to make additional income, which might be valuable, especially in these challenging times. That's if anybody's willing to pay for Airbnbs now. That seems doubtful with tourism taking a hit. But Airbnb has been really disruptive to a lot of neighborhoods. It's actually wiping out the keys. We saw that starting 3 years ago, where people buy a home, they own a home, and next door is basically it's a frat party every week. It can have really disruptive effects on neighborhoods, especially if you can't now localities are restricted from developing protective zoning. Zoning evolved for a really good reason, quiet enjoyment of your home.
If the federal government does not act soon, will homelessness and eviction be the legacies of COVID-19?
Sorry, say that again.
If the federal government does not act soon, will homelessness and eviction be the legacies of COVID-19?
Could be. Geez, with this level of employment, I can't see how we're not going to have a very serious homelessness, continuing unemployment, evictions, and foreclosure issue. I don't know how much further the federal government can go or is willing to go. We're recommending to our municipal clients is, don't wait. Start developing your own solutions, partner with those private sources that are going to be coming into this market. Start developing whatever, non-cash solutions you can to make it easier for somebody to develop, provide, or stay in an affordable unit. Yeah, I mean, it's going to take a combination of federal and local sources, but don't wait for the feds to come in. They've already committed a lot.
Well, I'd also say as well, and that's why it's so important for localities to address this, is that we know that the numbers show female-headed households with children are one of the most vulnerable households being impacted by the job loss, and of course what that will mean relative to rents, should these programs not continue. So we can't wait. We cannot, and Kevin's been saying it together for some time now. We cannot wait for what comes out of Washington. It's even if there is a program, it'll be inadequate to address the level of need that we're going to have here are, without question, in not only in Miami-Dade, but in Broward and Palm Beach. And like I said, a lot of these are going to be female-headed households with children who would be on the streets. So we have to anticipate that and plan for it now, and we can't wait for Tallahassee and Washington.
Thank you so much. And final question. How can the county play a bigger role in preventing displacement instead of leaving most planning and zoning to the city level?
Ned, you want to start?
I didn't get the full question.
How can the county play a bigger role in preventing displacement instead of leaving most planning and zoning to the city level?
Well, it's not so much a planning and zoning issue at the city level. It's once again having policies in place and particularly from a housing standpoint, which they don't have right now, an affordable housing master plan similar to what the city of Miami has adopted, that does address this issue, which is becoming even pre-COVID a major concern, certainly here in Miami, where we have displacement and gentrification occurring on a regular basis. But you need your affordable housing master plan to drive your planning and zoning. Your planning and zoning are really tools for implementing those policies that would prevent that. But not only prevent it, but as we've been saying, and Kevin's been saying, to provide the opportunities in the first place for residents and for businesses to stay where they are. We can't continue to see what's happened in Little Haiti and Little Havana and Allapattah continue, and it would have. We may be in a stall pattern right now, but that's going to come back again because that was the pattern of development that was occurring. But it starts really with having that affordable housing master plan or affordable housing, strategic plan that's in place that then drives your planning and zoning to prevent this type of thing at the same time providing opportunities.
Yeah, the county actually completed a massive upzoning effort prior to the pandemic, and it was relative to the smart corridors for mass transit development. So there's was it seven corridors? They're significantly upzoned, up to 225 units per acre. So they already did, and I think that's fortuitous because now those corridors, well, you built more value into the land that was already there, just being able to build more units on it. I think the key question is going to be in terms of funding and financing from the county. And I think the case needs to be made that the county's the biggest player in the region. Find a way to start building funds. City of Miami made a massive commitment. It is on hold right now, but made a really massive commitment to affordable housing in its budget. And I think the county, we need to make the case that the county needs to step up with something, at scale with what the City of Miami had done, especially in light of the pandemic now.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us this morning. So this will conclude today's discussion. This is a great conversation. We got so many questions from the audience, more than any of our other webinars. I think we got between 30 and 40 questions. So that was pretty neat, a lot of interaction. We will be sending everyone who registered today slides from the presentation as well as the recording. You can always find that on our website. Which also has recordings from previous webinars. This is a continuation of our series on the COVID-19 pandemic and how it's going to, what its impact is on the South Florida community. But if you'd like to ask any more questions, we'll also be sending contact information from today's speakers. And with that, thank you once more, and thank you to the panel for providing such great information for everyone. Bye, everyone.